I really want to call down our next witness, Professor Angel Harris, a professor of sociology and African American studies at Duke University. I can't thank him enough for being here today, and we'll let him walk down and the chance to walk out.
What is the psychology behind opening a drugstore at the corner? Think of any CVS, Rite Aid,
And Carmen, I hear you. No, I hear you. In all due respect. If I can help, if I can help, that's all I'm saying. If I can help. That's all right. I'm just saying, if I can help make it happen.
two Rite Aids in the same block.
Dr. Harris, I can't thank you enough. We'll just take another minute. I know some people want to greet Chancellor Farina.
And you're right. If Rite Aid opens here, CVS opens across the street.
When you've been in education as long as Carmen Farina, and there's 300 people, 100 people in the audience, she knows every one of them, so we have to let her have a minute. Okay, everybody, let's see if we can keep going. It is 12:30, and we've had colleagues waiting who I, encouraged some people to come and testify, and now they're waiting, so we want to keep going. I just want to thank Dr. Harris. I want to point out to those who have not read it that there was a very interesting article in the New York Times, September 8th, that talked about the push to involve parents in their children's education, and Dr. Harris has done some research on this, and we were just so impressed with the article and his quotes in the article. We asked if he would come up to Albany from Duke University and talk to us today about what a good receivership model or a good community school model should be. So, to bring the perspective that he has. So, again, thank you so much, and the floor is yours, and we so appreciate your coming today. Thank you again.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it should work. Just,
Is it on?
I guess just touch it one more time.
Push it one more time.
Try again. Just once.
Oh. It's there? Yep. Okay. I was looking for the little light.
You can bring it a little closer, too.
Okay.
They live stream it, so the mic has to be on for the people listening on computer to hear it. But I always say that the people in the audience matter. They took the time to come, so they'll hear you no matter what. But I think
Okay.
that's fine. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. So what I'm going to do this morning, briefly, is I'm going to talk about the problem that I see in education in terms of achievement and achievement gaps. I'm then going to offer some brief explanations, and then why I think the problem persists and some potential solutions. So first, I want to give context for the problem. Among 12th graders, Black and Hispanic 12th graders are graduating high school with the same skill sets that whites had in the 8th grade. So let me say that a different way. On average, Black and Hispanic 12th graders are graduating high school with 8th grade skill set. Okay, this is an underestimate of the gap because this is the gap among persisters, people who have remained in school. The other issue is that this gap is pervasive. And so when you look at data from National Assessment of Educational Progress, you see that there are huge gaps in reading, writing, math, science, and U.S. history. In fact, roughly 1/3 of Black and Hispanic students are proficient in math, science, and U.S. history. That's just 1/3. And slightly more than 50% are proficient in reading. Okay, so it's a 4-year gap. It's pretty big. It's pervasive. It spans across a wide range of subjects. And what's happening to this gap over time? Well, analysis of NAEP data suggests that the gap is going to take roughly 3 to 5 decades for the gap to close in reading and math. Analysis of non-NAEP surveys show that the gap may take approximately 5 decades in reading to close and about 10 decades in math, given the rate of decline from 1960 to 1990. So that's given the rate of decline, absent any major intervention as things are going. Now, those projections were from 1960 to 1990. If we look at what's happened since the 1990s, if you look at SAT, let's take the SAT, for example, which is perhaps the most consequential of exams, you see that the lines are parallel. Regardless of the scores, since 1990 to 2014, the lines are parallel across racial groups. So, for example, when I say that, I mean for Asian Americans, you have a particular achievement from year to year. For whites, for Hispanics, and Blacks, and those lines are not converging. All right, so the achievement gap is persistent, and we haven't even begun to cut into those projected declines, okay, absent any major intervention. The other thing is that the gap exists on GPA, test scores. Doesn't matter what measure of achievement you use, you're going to see a gap. The gap exists on college attainment, college enrollment, high school graduation rate. This gap is there, and it's persistent. Anytime you look at trends over time, and I'm talking about over decades, you see parallel lines. The reason why this is important, of course, is because you know that the U.S. population is rapidly diversifying, and by 2030, which is 15 years from now, it's not a long time from now, roughly 45% of the population is going to be comprised of non-whites. You cannot have nearly half your population walking around with 8th grade skill set. There's no way that doesn't affect everyone. So given that that's the problem, what are some explanations put forward to explain it? One is that the gap is genetic in origin. However, that doesn't really have much empirical support, so I will skip that explanation. Another one is that a large part of the gap is due to, and when I say gap, I mean the lower achievement of Black and Hispanic students relative to whites and Asian Americans. Another explanation is that the gap is due to socioeconomic status. Something related to resources, whether schools are not funded as adequately or whether or not parents are not doing well financially. There's always some kind of financial explanation. However, that accounts for about a third of the gap. In other words, when you compare children who are similarly situated with regard to resources, the gap is only about a third smaller. That's why we see gaps in districts that are affluent, like Shaker Heights, Ohio, Prince George's County, Maryland. Even though those are affluent districts where you think resources are accounted for, you still have a gap. The other reason is because, of course, school tracking, and some of that has to do with kids being placed in certain tracks, and so that's one of the other reasons. And then another reason people say is that perhaps Black and Hispanic students don't want to learn. They have this culture that's oppositional towards schooling. In my work, empirically, I have debunked that theory, and I've shown empirically that that's not the case, so I won't spend much time on that. So now I'm going to talk about why I think the problem persists. So first is we do not respect this problem. And so anytime I hear someone say we need to close the gap within 2 years, we need to bring up achievement and close the gap within my time in office, I always think that person does not respect the problem. The reason why is because I would never walk into the office of an oncologist and say, you've had millions of dollars devoted to cancer research, a lot of research, I want a cure by next week. I respect that problem. This is like that. When you look at the trend lines that I showed you and it's in your packet, there's no way the gap could be closed in a year or 2 years, absent any major intervention. You can't get to Cali in 10 minutes driving. It's not possible, you know? So essentially what I'm saying is that we don't respect this problem enough to understand that this is a problem that's likely going to be around for a decade or two unless we have some major drastic difference in how we do things. The other reason why the gap persists is because we don't have a real true dialogue on race. And so when we're talking about low achievement and low achieving schools, it's a discussion about race. Who are the low achievers? It's usually Blacks and Hispanics. And what happens is that one thing we don't acknowledge is that we all have biases. And there are studies that show that teachers have biases. I'll give you one example of one study in which you had a Black child and a white child who were video recorded for a day. And they were asked for the first day, today you guys are going to be white for the day. You can imagine what that means. For the whole day, they were white. In other words, they had the telephone voice. When you're on the phone and you're trying to be, and they were white for the day. And they were video recorded. And the next day, they were told to be Black for a day and video recorded again. And then these videos were shown to teachers, and the teachers were asked to rate the students in terms of problem behaviors, the need for special education, and achievement. And the Black for a day were rated worst on all, just on the basis of the video. So this is capturing some unconscious bias. We all have these biases. It's not honorable to say, oh, I don't see color, I don't have this bias. It's really important to say, look, here's a bias that I have, and some biases you may not know you have. I think it's a big deal when I change my child's diaper. I say, look, I changed diaper. And I tell my wife I changed them twice, and she goes, okay. And then I realize, oh my goodness, I'm so gendered. I'm so biased. Like, I'm saying that as if to say that I deserve a medal for this, right? And so I acknowledge the fact that I have these biases, and we all have these biases. And so if we don't talk about race in a true way, then what happens is teachers are in the classroom with these biases towards Blacks, towards Hispanics, even toward Asians. And what happens is these biases go unchecked, but they play a role in how they perceive the student, right? The other issue is that we fear innovation. And so what I see in education is incremental changes. What often happens is we say, we're going to make a change. Let's change the superintendent. We're going to make a change. Let's change teachers. It's still the same system, right? And so essentially it's like shooting a BB gun at a freight train, right? There's no change. You can't change the game of basketball by raising the goal by 1 inch. You can't change the game of football by expanding the field by 1 yard. A real change is saying we're going to add 3 end zones, and the field's going to shape like a triangle. That's a different game. I don't know what that looks like, but that's an entirely different game, and we're afraid of that kind of change. And so education largely looks similar now the way it did, let's say, 2-3 decades ago. It's still the same model. And the last reason why the gap persists, I think, is because there's lack of understanding of research. And so what happens is that we make decisions on the basis of gut. We make decisions on the basis of, we eyeball things, right? We say, here's what we think needs to happen, and then that's what we go with, and it's based on our gut. And so if you say, I think we need to do this, if I ask you, what percentage of the problem does that thing you're suggesting explain? If you can't give me an answer, you're shooting from the hip. You're eyeballing it. It's based on gut. And so one thing we do with research is we're able to see what percentage of a problem each thing explains. So for example, what we do is I can tell you if everyone suggests to me, here's why I think there's a problem and here's how I think we can solve the problem, and everyone makes a suggestion, if you give me time to collect data, I can come back and tell you, what you suggest explains about 5%. What you suggest explains about 15%. Yours about 50%. It's the most costly, but it's 50%, right? And so there's a way to ascertain what proportion of the problem or the solution each thing contributes, right? And that can only be done by research. What I find is that we're investing in things that explain probably 1 or 2%, and then we wonder why we're spinning our wheels because we're using gut. One of those things is, let's say, parental involvement. And so if you asked me 2 years ago, do you think parental involvement is important? Does it matter? Does it increase achievement? My answer to you would have been, I don't know, right? I don't know because my answer would have been from the gut, right? And so what I would say now, so I conducted a study, and it's in a book published called The Broken Compass. And in this study, the findings show that parental involvement is not going to be the thing to solve our problem, right? So what do I mean by that? I'll give you 2 examples. One, if we're trying to close the gap or we're trying to bring up achievement of low achievers, then if you say parental involvement is the policy, right, then the expectation is that the parents of the low achievers are going to be involved, and they're going to be involved in a way that increases achievement. That's the assumption. Well, what I did was I used nationally representative data, and I sorted how parents respond to poor performance into 2 groups, 2 categories: punitive responses and non-punitive responses. Punitive, punish the child, withhold rewards. Non-punitive, talk to the teacher, help with homework, contact the teacher, things like that, encourage. What I found was that in response to poor performance, Black parents are more likely to engage in punitive responses. Working class parents are more likely to engage in punitive responses. White parents are more likely to engage in non-punitive responses. Now, then I examined how responses to poor performance relate to achievement. And what I found was that punitive responses are associated with declines in achievement. Even if the analysis were conducted among whites alone and then among Blacks alone, punitive responses are associated with declines in achievement and non-punitive associated with increases. Blacks are doing more of what hurts, the punitive, and less of what helps. So then I ask you, do you really want the parents of poor achievers to be involved? You're asking them to be involved, and they're going to say, okay, I'm going to be involved. And they're activating, they're pushing their policy button, and they're saying, I'm going to fix this poor performance. And you think, yep, they're involved, I've done it. The problem is that you don't realize you just asked the parents, and they're working against you. They're pulling in the other direction. Inadvertently, of course. The assumption we make is that parents know how to be involved, and that's a flawed assumption. The second example I'll give is in the book I had 62 measures of parental involvement. And some of these were, talk to your child about school, talk to your child about their future, about college, help them with homework, read to the child, have rules about homework, GPA, talk to the teacher, 62 of these things. And what I did was just for each racial group, for whites alone, I'd had 6 racial groups: whites, Blacks, Mexican Americans, non-Mexican Hispanics, and 2 categories of Asian Americans. And for each group separately, I said, okay, of all these measures of parental involvement, which ones are associated with increases in achievement, right? And if you line all 62 up, I'm just giving an example. For whites, measure 13, 45, and 52 are related to increases. When you look at blacks, it's a completely set of measures that matter for achievement. When you look at Hispanics, it's a completely set of measures. In other words, it's not a one-size-fits-all. The dangerous thing about it is that about 5 to 10% of the measures were associated with increases in achievement across the board. About 30% were associated with declines in achievement. 50% were not associated with achievement at all. So in other words, when we ask parents to be involved, it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag by race and class. And in most cases, there are more landmines than benefits, right? So in other words, if you want parents to be part of your policy, I'm not saying they shouldn't be a part of it. What I'm saying is don't assume they have the answers. You also have to then incorporate some measure to say, okay, here's how you be involved, right? And so about the only measure that was consistent across the board was help with homework. Regardless of race, class, parents who help with homework, those children had lower achievement than the parents who didn't. And this is controlling for prior achievement. So this is not that they're responding to poor achievement. And so, in other words, when you help with homework, you're probably getting in the way, you're not doing it right. Let's be realistic. By the 5th grade, most parents can't help their kids with math. By the 6th, 7th grade, forget about it. You know, the first thing you say is, bring me the textbook. What did the teacher say? You know, and so I think in order to solve the problem, we have to really rely on research. If I were to solve the problem, I think the one way to improve schools is to conduct a study on target schools. Without conducting a study, suggestions are generic, driven by ideology, and based on a one-size-fits-all mentality. I would conduct a study on the schools in question and generate data that would enable me to determine which factors are associated with increases and declines in achievement. I would also implement and evaluate alternative models of instruction. After the first year of data collection, decisions would be guided entirely by empiricism. And decisions would optimize entirely on increasing achievement, of course, taking into account budget constraints.
I really want to thank you for the research that you've done. It certainly makes sense to me as you play it out, and it's a very good insight. I thank you so much for making the trip up from Duke, and that we, read your comments and that you would participate with us. I would certainly like to follow up with you about some of your research and make sure that it's available to the school districts, the 17 school districts, and the State Education Department. If you were to give any advice based on your research to the State Education Department or to us today, now, not to put you on the spot too much, as to what we could do when we talk about assisting struggling schools. Obviously, parents are part of that, though. What would you recommend? How would you? Yeah,
so my answer is not going to be very satisfying.
If you were Commissioner Elia, what would you do?
Yes, so what I would do is I would take about maybe 2 to 3 years of doing massive data collection. And what I would do is, let's say I have, 100 schools. I would have data collection efforts, and I would have alternative models of instruction across schools, right? And then what I would do is I'd collect data at the beginning of the year and then at the end of the year. Do that for 3 years. And then I would analyze and see which model of instruction led to the largest gains in achievement from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, right? And those would be the ones that I would push. I would also determine what the relationship is between various factors. Everyone who says they have a suggestion of how to improve it, I would tell you this accounts for 20%, this accounts for 5%. I would determine what each thing accounts for, and then it's up to you to decide what to invest in.
One of the problems, of course, that we have as policymakers is that it's very difficult to do that.
Yes.
First of all, people don't want to feel that they're going to wait. This has been a crisis in America really for 40 years. How do we prepare children, et cetera, et cetera? We have done, I think, some innovative things in New York, for example, when we authorized charter schools, which promised a break from the past and new techniques and new ways of doing things. So now we have to evaluate that as we go into, say, the 15th and 16th year of that program and maybe look at some others. I also think we need to look at this group of schools. They need support now. So I appreciate it, and I think the research will be there because the state is creating so many databases. But it's going to be interesting to see whether we can move some of these schools out of receivership with the techniques we have now. I think it may be interesting comparison study because, as both you and Chancellor Frenier and Commissioner Elia said, no, it isn't one size fits all. Different schools need different things. Any thoughts, though, on how we could increase parental involvement in a positive way at these schools? I mean, I can tell you, look, my son goes to New York City Public High School. I go to a PTA meeting, sometimes there's 10 of us there. There's 4,000 students at the school. So I agree with what you are saying, and certainly Chancellor Farini pointed out, it can't just be the PTA, that old scale model. But what do we replace that with, and any suggestions on your part?
Yeah, so two things. The sense of urgency in dealing with these schools, I can totally appreciate the sense of urgency. The danger of that sense of urgency is that it can lead people down the path of saying, we have to do something now, and then you end up spinning your wheels because all the suggestions are made based on gut. And people say, I think it's this, I think it's that, but nobody really knows what, they really don't know. People are just shooting from the hip.
Well, I just want to say, part of it is everyone went to school. What I
Yes.
find is people are nostalgic. I always say this, nostalgic for a past that never was.
Right.
So people have these anecdotes and stories in the legislature, and, people come to hearings, and it's great, and we're glad that their mother cooked them lunch or whatever the story is that they want to share. But it's hard to then make that into a policy, So I totally agree with that.
Yeah, people are very comfortable. I have a saying that says, don't believe everything you think, because most of what you think is wrong. And so people are very, very comfortable believing what they think, and if you put it to the test, they'll often find that, I've been spinning my wheels, and there's a reason why. In terms of parental involvement, I think it's important to understand that children who are struggling, the assumption is that if you say parental involvement is the reason why, then the assumption is that those parents don't care about their kids as much. The assumption is that they're not as involved. And so it leads to cultural deficiency narratives about parents, Black and Hispanic parents.
I agree. Terrible.
And so we forget that. I think the reason why kids who are doing well and they have parents who are look like they're highly involved, the reality is that there's a context there that matters. So, for example, if you take the average achievement for children of the children, for everyone in this room who has children, the average achievement of those children is going to be higher than the regular population. And the reason why is because when they go home, there's probably going to be a home office. Most of the parents' friends are going to be highly educated. There's going to be verbal jousting in the house. There's going to be something in the air that the kid is absorbing. And so whether you talk to your child or not, chances are that kid is going to be pretty good academically, right? And so we like to take credit and say, oh, it's my superior parenting. That's not. Yeah, what it has to do with the fact is that we've created a context and we live a particular lifestyle that is related to increase in achievement, regardless of how often we interact with our children, right? And so it's harder for people who are in a different context. And so to put pressure on them to say you have to be involved and you have to do this. And they don't have the answers, they don't know how to do it. What you're doing is you may be asking them to pull the rope in the other direction inadvertently. And so what I would suggest is if you're going to call for parental involvement, you better know how to tell parents how to be involved, and you better know what are the things that are associated with increase in achievement and those that increase with declines in achievement. And you can't know that on the basis of your gut or what you feel or ideology. It feels good to think we matter, but at the end of the day, we're very limited in how much we matter empirically, on the empirical level.
Thank you. Anyone question, colleague? Anybody?
No,
Comment?
Professor, thank
Yes.
you very much. I love your presentation.
I'm so happy we got him here, Carmen. I'm so happy about it. No, I do.
Thank
I
you,
feel
thank
as you do. We're very
He's-
thrilled you're here.
He is so different from the other person that was sitting there. I think that you are a smart fellow. You are doing a great job. And I want to make a comment on parent involvement.
Sure.
One thing is to have the parent in my community, from 10 children, 5 are grandparents, the ones that are taking care of the children. Then we have problems with that. But I can see that grandparents are always there in the school. The parents, I don't know where they are.
Yeah, no, no.
And that is very serious. I think that we need social workers working with these families, because a social worker can assess the problem quickly, because days in the life of children in education are really very important. Every day is very important, because every day he will learn or she will learn something new that if she misses it today, she won't catch tomorrow. And I'm concerned about that. And parent involvement depends very much in who coach them. If it's the principal that I just mentioned before, that and those principals that have a rule that your child will go to a special education because he doesn't speak English, and we fought that 30 years ago, and it's happening today, it's very, very tough to work with. I think that we have to go back to have social workers, or at least family assistants in the schools and in the systems and those individuals have to be independent from the principal office, because the principal is going to use his desire all the time. He's the boss there, and everybody has to do what he or she said.
So, can I respond? So context matters, and when people talk about parental involvement or policy issues, they often talk about it. It's just a blanket statement. It just do this, and it's uniform across everybody. And what they don't appreciate is that. And this is why in the study, I ran the findings separately for each racial group. I ran the study separately by class. And the reason why is because the things that may be effective for Hispanic parents is going to be very different than things that might be effective for black parents. It's a different context. It's a different situation they're dealing with. And so because of that, we can't say all parents should do this. No, all parents should not do this. To me, that sounds like a ridiculous statement. I think what we need to find out is we need to find out what works for which groups, and then maximize that. Otherwise, we just continue spinning our wheels, and then 10 years from now, we'll be having the same hearing saying, what do we do now? And the reason why is because we're spinning our wheels, and we're relying too much on gut and what we feel. It makes us feel good, you know.
Yes, I so agree with that. You know, people keep saying everyone should read to their child and all that. That's not every family's setup. Some family, the grandparents read, or they get read to at church, or there's a much more complicated thing than that. And if the parent doesn't feel comfortable reading, you know, and then we have to value people that obviously bilingual is so important, et cetera. So I really appreciate you bringing that, but almost a research-based perspective to that, because as you said, often it's our gut, and we need the research to back it up. So I really appreciate it. Gary, did you have a question? And then,
Yes, just a
and then
quick,
we're going to.
I guess,
You
question
made the
statement.
trip, so we want to make sure that we.
Sure.
Professor, first I want to thank you for coming up to sunny Albany. You notice our trees are changing.
Well, originally I'm from Brooklyn, New York.
Well, okay.
So I'm a product of New York Public
My
Schools.
father through Brooklyn. He's from Virginia. But anyway, when the chairwoman had asked you what would be your suggestion, you said that you would take X number of schools and divide the curriculum to third, and see which one worked, and then that would be the goal that we would try to achieve, the one that worked. Prior to that, though, you said that it would take between 20 and 30 years
Yes.
to close the gap. I'm hearing that you're suggesting that the direction that we're heading in is not the proper direction, and if we do what we're planning to do based on what you've read, we're not going to succeed in closing the gap and doing it is what we want to do. If we were to change courses and go with your idea of like taking the 3 years to assess where the breakdown in education is, and then reassign all these other students, do you think it'll still take 3 decades to close the gap, or would that be a much more prudent direction for us to take and close that gap a lot quicker?
Well, first, New York is not unlike any other state in the country. And so the figures that I presented to you are based on national data. So this is the case all over the country, regardless of the state. You have these patterns, and the projections are what they are. One thing I mentioned when I mentioned the projections were absent major intervention, right? And so, you know, if it's going to take, 2.5 hours or 3 hours to drive to New York City, absent major intervention, you might be able to get there in an hour. That would require a new intervention. right, that we don't have yet, if you were driving, of course. And so...
Obviously, I've never driven with a Simon Pretlow.
Those Bugattis are quick.
He's achieved that.
That's a major intervention.
He has a unique distinction in that regard. I'm afraid to get in a car with him, but yes.
That's a major intervention. But absent any major intervention.
Sorry.
Now, when I said...
Just teasing, just teasing.
When I said 3 years, I just threw a number out, right? It could be as soon as 1 year. So, for example, right now in North Carolina, I am overseeing a study in Wake County Public Schools. Wake County Public Schools is the largest district in the state of North Carolina. And that intervention, they made 32 schools available to us. And so I've sorted the schools into 2 groups, 16 control schools and 16 experimental schools. And in the experimental schools, they're undergoing a new K-2 model of instruction. In other words, it's just a way of teaching. They're using the same curriculum, but they're just teaching the stuff differently. And so it's being done in these 16 schools. We've just completed the first year. And after the first year, the 16 schools in the experimental group showed a 3% greater growth in achievement than those in the control schools. Now that's year 1. The teachers are new to it. They're trying it out. And so it's clunky. Now they're in the second year of it. And those kindergartners last year are now in the first grade. And then next year they're going to have it again in the second grade. And the idea is that by the third grade, we should see that they have higher achievement than the kids in the control schools, and that a greater share of them are identified as gifted and talented, which is the goal for North Carolina. The goal for me is to increase achievement and to close the achievement gap. And so that's a study, and I can tell you that at the end of this year, there were some results. At the end of the second and third year, if I find that, hey, the schools in this program actually had greater gains in achievement from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, we have something, and it may be expanded to the rest of the district, perhaps the rest of the state. That's decision based on research. And I don't have a rooting interest. For me, I don't care emotionally whether parents matter or not. For me, it's about do they, yes or no. And it's purely from the research standpoint. So when I said 3 years, I really mean it could be after 1 year. You could have schools divided into certain groups, have different interventions in different schools, and then you might find that after 1 year, 2 or 3 of those interventions actually work, and these other things that other people suggested didn't. And then you say, wow, let's do this across the board and continue measuring over time. So it could be as soon as 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. So the way things are going now, it's probably similar to the way things have been going in the past. Many of the suggestions are probably based on gut. I don't know. But what I would say is in order to ensure that they're not based on gut is I would devise a mechanism by which decisions are made on the basis of data and evidence, right? And so when someone says, I think it's this, I can come back to you and tell you, I've run numbers, and I can tell you that that's about 10%. That might be worth doing, right? And so the projections are absent major intervention.
I think we're gonna have to move on a little bit. I know other colleagues might want to go, but we have a full witness list. I really want to thank you for giving that perspective, and expect we'll be talking to you and reaching out to you again. And I really thank you. Very appreciative that you would come. Thank you for all the great research you're doing too.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I know we always have a little transition if people want to speak with Professor Harris. You know, our Sergeant at Arms, Wayne Jackson, is here. I appreciate that, Wayne. When we have a guest from Duke University, we want him to make sure that he feels welcome.